Hello, my name is Alex Isles and welcome to Ingram Valley in Northumberland National Park. In today's episode I'm going to be discussing what would life be like for the Iron Age Britons. Now, we've discussed the hill forts and we've talked about the elites living in their hill forts and how this new aristocracy came through. They lived obviously in their round houses, which were quite large, on top of the hill forts, and when they lived in those areas they would have, you know, their swords, their spears, their bronze items, jewelry, things like that, and their war bands around them. But they weren't the whole population. That's the elite. These are the highly powerful individuals who are almost like sort of like warrior cowboys. Their wealth is in cattle, their wealth is in the farm produce of the land around, and they have to in turn make sure they protect the local people, and they have to protect the boundaries so they can constantly get the benefit of that wealth and continue to show the power of their tribe. The normal people, they would have lived slightly differently. Now initially they would have lived in little settlements where you would have the round houses, wooden round houses, and these wooden round houses would have had a ditched enclosure or palisade around them. They would have been relatively close to a hill fort, but far enough away so that there would be a distinction between the power of the elite and the normal people. When you have these enclosures, these people would then have gone out and farmed the landscape. They would have been answerable to the Iron Age elite, these powerful individuals who are living in the hill forts, but they would have also lived in and around the land as well. What happens next though is that when the Romans invade, we see these settlements becoming undefended. So it seems that maybe the Romans are having much more influence and they're saying, right, we don't want you to have defended settlements. We want these settlements to be undefended, but in turn you're under the Pax Romana. They maybe would have sent troops up to support the tribes up here, which is probably the Vortidini in this particular case, and then if they sent Roman troops up here, then they would protect the Vortidini and go alongside the Vortidini's troops to fight against other rival tribes. Alternatively, the Romans may have just said, no, we don't want defended settlements, and then the local elite would have enforced this. So that may have been the setup up here. But what you see is a number of round houses in a certain area, and then they would have farmed the area around that. We also noticed that around hill forts there seems to be a clear demarcation between the land which is under the hill forts authority and the land that is around it for the normal people to farm. And so the hill fort would probably have had land which would have supplied it directly with food, much like later on when we see with Anglo-Saxon capitals and palaces, there's a certain area where there are the king's estates. And this is also seen again in Pictish territory and also in British territory as well in the Dark Ages, where you have royal palaces which are expected to provide a certain amount of food for a royal, for a king or coming through with his entourage. So around the hill forts, those aristocrats would have had their own land which would have supplied them with food, and then the normal people would have farmed their own area as well and then paid taxes of, again, likely food, because they didn't have a coin-based economy. Instead they had a food-based or a barter and trade equal value-based economy. So maybe they're paying their taxes in sheep or cattle, and it seems like cattle were incredibly important to these Iron Age people and may have actually reflected that in the way they reflected wealth. You know, the large cattle herds that these warrior elite have would have been brought to centralized locations, and then they would have large feasts or gatherings and things like that, which we'll see when I'm at a location called Yeavering Bell, and I'll discuss that in a little bit more depth there. Why don't we go across now to Segedunum Roman Fort, where I've actually filmed a section looking at how the Iron Age roundhouse would have looked and how the people would have lived in and amongst a roundhouse in the past. We're just going to have a look at some of the native roundhouses that may have been built in and around the British Isles. Now, there are not many reconstructed roundhouses up here in the northeast of England, but here inside Segedunum Roman Fort, we do have an example of what a roundhouse may have looked like. Now, roundhouses are generally what we consider the native peoples of the British Isles to have lived in before the Roman occupation and through the Roman occupation right into the period we call the early Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. Now, when you think of a roundhouse, often in film and cinema, these are depicted as dark buildings. They're depicted as, you know, the natives being covered in mud and dirty and very dark clothing, whereas the Romans are bright and colourful with their red tunics and things like that. But very fortunately, thankfully, that's a bit of Hollywood bias. They want to show the barbarians as uncivilized and the Romans as civilized. But these huts were actually very effective. Huts like these that had been in existence from the last Bronze Age, but they had changed in style slightly and adapted over the period, within the Iron Age much larger houses being occupied by large families. So right here what we can see is that you would have central posts which would go around the outside of the roundhouse, obviously in a circular shape. Then you would have branches that would be weaved between the posts, and then there would be daub put on top of these. And the daub would have been made from a combination of clay and animal waste, animal dung, and water. And then you had the right mix together. You mix straw through that as well, and then from that you would have the perfect basically covering that you could then paint or whitewash. So you might have quite a bright colour on the inside of the roundhouse. Alongside this as well, they may have painted it with symbols or motifs that were important to their culture. On the upper levels, they're now starting to look at roundhouses, and especially with the size of them, they're now starting to think they're two-story buildings. So because of that, you may have had a ladder that would have taken you up onto a boarded section on the second level where you would maybe have your day-to-day life. And so then maybe you would have a fire up there, which would be on a raised platform, and that would keep you warm, or you would have a fire down here as well. In some of the larger roundhouses, they've also had a look at the idea of having animals in the ground level and people living upstairs. And the way you would obviously heat your upstairs section is that you would have a stone placed down and you would build a fire around the outside of it, and that would therefore keep it a lot more safe, especially when you've got the thatch on the top of the roundhouses as well. This particular roundhouse is done out with a wooden structure, but we also have stone-built roundhouses as well. So there was a variety of different ways that these houses could be built and could be designed throughout the whole of the region. In the Roman Iron Age, so once the Romans have invaded Britain and started to put their power onto the landscape by putting monuments such as Hadrian's Wall and the Roman forts in northern Britain in place, there would have been interactions between the normal Iron Age Britons and the Romans as well. These interactions would have transformed over the period because sometimes they would be quite peaceful. The Romans would need to buy and trade some of their goods with the native Britons because of the fact that they would need additional foods or supplies or things that the native Britons could produce. So for instance, maybe a local fashion item or something like that, which the Roman soldiers particularly liked, would be able to be produced for them, and then they would then take that home with them as well. A good example of this is in the 2nd century AD. We see a new type of brooch start to appear in the Roman Empire, and it's called dragonesque. A dragonesque brooch almost looks like a serpent, and it would have been used to fashion your cloak together. So with a dragonesque brooch, the soldiers are saying that they are a part of, well, they've been stationed in Britain and it's a new fashion thing that they can show off to their friends and families. So the natives may have been producing cloth, they may have been producing things like brooches or different things of art and culture that they would be selling to the Roman soldiers. Alternatively, the Roman soldiers are up here to collect taxes. They need to collect these taxes in food that then go into the whole military system up here in northern Britain, because they would need that additional food to maintain the huge amount of soldiers stationed on Hadrian's Wall and in other parts of northern Britain, and possibly even, due to some theories from some historians, to transport food from the north of Britain across into the Rhineland to actually support the military across there in their wars against the Germans. So it's very interesting to see how interconnected this whole area would have been, and the trade between natives and Romans may have been far more widespread than we believe, though it may be more invisible due to the fact that the trade may be in animals and other things like that, rather than the coin-based economy that we're so used to today. I really hope that's brought a roundhouse to life for you, and that you can see how the Iron Age Britons would have lived. The density of the settlements in the lowland areas of like every mile having a settlement would have also been reflected up here in the upland areas too, though there may have been more distance between them because of the fact that the land is actually much more separated or not as fertile for the native Britons. So I hope that's brought it to life. You've learned something about the Iron Age and how the people lived up here during this period. If you have enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe, share with your friends, and alongside that, if you'd like to support the channel further, I do have a Patreon, so you can then help to steer the content that I'll produce in the future. Until next time though, stay safe and well, and thank you so much for watching. I hope to share more history with you again soon.